is, as I was starting to hint at, certain areas of the law require it. Or push towards it. So in the First Amendment, or under the First Amendment, we largely push for more information with an emphasis on getting more information out there and restricting less. Contract law, you need to know what you're agreeing to before you agree to it. Tort law, there are various duties to warn and other obligations. And so that's why we end up in a situation in the United States where, for a variety of sort of purposive reasons and a variety of cultural reasons, transparency is such a fundamental tool. So where are we with transparency today? On the first hand, my primary focus, at least right now, is on privacy law. And we see in a lot of the pushes for privacy regulation in the United States a huge focus, once again, on transparency before anything else. So the infamous California Consumer Privacy Act that goes into effect in 2020 relies a lot on just shedding light on what the data broker industry is doing. And that's a sort of, again, very typically US focus on trying to find out the harms first before seriously regulating, though there are regulatory aspects of that act as well. Then we also see, as I hinted at the beginning of my presentation, a new form of calls for more transparency. Why do I call the right to explanation a new form? Well, because it requires companies to produce not just information that they already have, but a version of information that is understandable to the objects of algorithmic decision-making in a way that potentially allows them to contest the decision. So that's not just saying my industry is doing X. That's like there's an actual technical problem here of how to translate a machine learning algorithm into that form of consumable piece of information or actionable piece of information by individuals. So we're also seeing not just calls for more transparency, we're seeing significant backlash against transparency. On the one side, there is this notion that transparency ends up being this Band-Aid on a problem. So transparency can be, as a policy tool, can be heavily gamed, right? Whether you're the company that uses Freedom of Information Act requests to get information from the government and thereby actually more effectively compete with your competitors, or if you are the company that floods the government agency with information, which is known as information capture, through notice and comment or other proceedings. And there's this notion of using transparency to, in fact, hide the truth by giving individuals who want to know what's being done with their data so much information that they can't possibly parse it, right? So that's obfuscation through information as a particular form of transparency gaming. And then last, there's been this sort of trend, at least in the algorithmic accountability space, towards what I'm calling the transparency straw man. So that's saying, well, transparency doesn't work and it can't work, therefore just don't have it at all, right? And I, for one, am skeptical about that, so we can talk about this in the course of the panel. But it's become a particular line of argument in the algorithmic accountability space when you're talking in particular about transparency towards individuals that's consumable by individuals. All right, so to wrap things up, I think we need more critical conversations. Of course, I'm a law professor, so that benefits my career, so of course I'm calling for that. We need to be talking more specifically when we talk about transparency as a tool, what that particular mode of transparency is for. Right? Why is it that we have that? Do we have that to produce public shaming? Do we have that as a pre-regulatory tool? Do we have that to enable input by expert third parties into a system? And what kinds of transparency are good for different things, right? So mapping on the type of transparency you're talking about onto the purpose of that transparency. And roughly speaking, this maps into conversations about who gives what to whom, how. You can give transparency in one fell swoop with a huge amount of information that's highly technical. You can give transparency over a longer period of time by having an expert board sit and provide oversight over a longer period of time. And then there's a very closely related conversation that I want to wrap up with, which is the question of whether transparency by itself is effective. So maybe possibly passing something on to the debate for later today, what I find so fascinating is that in the United States, we constantly talk about privacy and whether harms are real. And yet we also assume that the kind of behavioral changes that are caused by transparency are real, right? You question whether the government watching what you search for online causes you to change your behavior, but you assume that providing transparency into a government meeting is going to cause the government to change its behavior. So we have kind of doublespeak going on here on how we make transparency effective compared to how much faith we do or don't place in the existence of privacy harms. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap up and pass things off to the next presenter. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Now we'll hear from Hal.
All right. Is that it? So how do I advance it with the space bar?
So I think should just be able to scroll down.
See, it's not really aligned.
It's
There we go. All right. Well, I think we have a bit of a resolution mismatch here, but anyway. So I'd like to answer some questions about Google's transparency in various dimensions, because there's a lot of confusion out there. We're always asked to be more transparent on this or that, but I want to describe some of the many ways that it is transparent. And let's see, we'll go through this rather. All right, so in particular, I'm going to how Google makes money, what competition looks like in search, some acquisition issues, R&D and venture funding, and finally data portability. So how does Google make money? All right, most of Google's revenue comes from ads on search. So you search for something, you see an ad. The way that works is the advertiser chooses a keyword. That's what the advertiser chooses. The user issues a query. If the query matches the keyword, the advertiser's ad is eligible to be shown. And that's very relevant because, after all, if the user searches for frying pan and the advertisers out there selling frying pans are going to match up, and then you'll be able to get an ad right when you're contemplating buying a product. So that's a very only one. Of course, detailed documentation for the advertisers about how they can use this system, and there are many analytic tools available to see how well the system is performing for you. And if you go look at Google's 10K, you can see how much money it makes from doing this. The other kind of advertising is display ads. So display ads appear on third parties like newspapers and publishers of other sorts. And what happens is those publishers receive a payment of 70% of the revenue that's made from the advertiser's expenditure, okay? And that amounted to about $12 billion last year. It's called TAC, or traffic acquisition costs. The net revenue from that form of advertising was about $5 billion. And that, of course, has to cover all the cost of serving, because all the advertiser has to do, all the publisher has to do is put in a little HTML and said, stick an ad here when you find one that's good. All right, and what does good mean? Well, I'll talk about that in terms of its targeting. Now, the targeting type is chosen by the advertiser. The publisher can decide whether or not they want to accept that targeting. In green, the pharma companies in turquoise, and other tech companies in whatever that color is, purplish, I guess. So you can see that the biggest expenditure in the world, it is claimed, is Amazon. Second biggest, Apple. We actually have a little dispute over that because Amazon doesn't report its R&D directly. They report indirect components of it, so it's a calculated number. But in any event, you can see there's a huge amount of competition going on. And interestingly enough, look at the auto companies that are spending billions of dollars because of autonomous vehicles. It's an existential threat to their industry. And so they wouldn't even be on this list if it were 10 years ago, but they are very, very prominent now in terms of investment in both electric vehicles and self-driving cars. A lot of innovation. Startups. Little companies, we're now moving from the big companies to the little companies. This is a chart of venture funding, venture capital finance of US startups. The big peak was back in 2000. In 2008, that bar stops at 2017. 2018, we finally surpassed that dot-com bubble of 2000. So you can see very heavy investment in venture capital funded firms. Now, a lot of people ask, well, how does search work? This is this algorithmic disclosure. Should a company